I would like to invite on stage Mr. Dinesh Chand Sharma, Director Standard and Public Policy from SESEI. Everyone with the round of applause, please welcome Mr. Dinesh Chand Sharma for the presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. I know, especially when you start a session after the lunch with that kind of dessert, it becomes difficult to start with. Of course, we have to get back. We are a part of the conference, so we have to get back to our work. First of all, let me begin. It's indeed my pleasure to be a part of it, and thank you, Nadeem, for inviting me as part of this summit. In next 15-20 minutes, I think our next speaker, because of medical exigency, could not join the next session, so we have time. We can take as much time as we want, but I think my presentation will run through for 15 to 20 minutes. And as I represent European standards organizations in India, including the European Commission, so my presentation will talk about more a European perspective. And of course, I would be covering a few slides around the regulations, regulatory challenges, how European Commission have addressed those challenges, then a few slides on the cybersecurity side of it. Mostly it will be covering a bit background that how this particular metering, and when we talk about smart metering, we do talk about the grid as well. So how this smart energy element of products and services have evolved in Europe. So I will be talking about from a legislation, standards, and the challenges, including cybersecurity point of view. So let me begin with this. This is broadly my outline. Let me begin with sharing with you who am I in a little bit more details. As I said, I'm a Director of Public Policy and Standards, but I do represent an acronym called SESEI. And SESEI normally stands for Seconded European Standardization Expert in India. So on behalf of European Standards Organization, I'm based out of New Delhi, and I work with Indian counterpart, which means majorly Bureau of Indian Standard, and other organizations like India's Smart Grid Forum and the Ministry of Power, etc., to work together to globally harmonize these standards. When we talk about smart grid and smart meter, the good news is major part of the standards are the global standards. So IEC standards are the one which have been implemented in Europe as well as in India. So I'm SESEI. SESEI is a project which is of 5 partners. If you see SEN Senelec is equivalent of, SEN is ISO, Senelec is IEC, and if you see those 2 organizations in India, it is BIS. So SEN, Senelec is 2 organizations. Then ITSI is mainly into the telecom side of it. So when you talk about 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, ITSI is responsible for developing those standards along with 3GPP, third generation partnership project. And when you talk about IoT, it is one M2M partnership project. Then European Commission is also a part of this project as a partner. Now, there are few countries which follow the European Union rules, but they're not part of the Union. For example, Switzerland, Iceland, Liechtenstein, these are Norway, 4 countries. So they come together through an association called IFTA, European Free Trade Association. So they are also partner of this project. So all these 5 together created this project way back in 2012. Why this project? Because EU and India has a bilateral trade which is touching around 100 billion euros, very balanced trade. And when you talk about trade, the standards do come and play a role because they become a trade facilitator instead of trade barriers. I work on many sectors, but majorly if you bucket them, I work on digitization. So whenever any topic comes under digitization, I work on the standardization of it. And you can name it, smart grid and smart meter are part of it as well, because you're putting an ICT layer on top of your electrical layer. But then there are many sectors. You name it, I'm there. Quantum technologies, green hydrogen. So green and clean technologies and digitizations are my 2 major horizontal topic, and then I work on many topics as well. But today I'm here to share with you smart grid and smart meter. This is a bit of background. If you see it, EU framework has some targets, defined targets, on climate and energy for 2030. They target to reduce greenhouse emission by 40% and increase the use of renewable at least 27% by 2030. It's not possible to have that presentation on that screen. Can you put that presentation on that screen? आप उस पे डाल सकते हैं? Because I have to turn back. Speaker में नहीं आता है. No problem. It's okay. So if you see, by 2030, European Commission or European framework target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% and increase the use of renewable to at least 27% by 2030. And to achieve these targets, the smart grid and smart meter, which together we call it smart energy, does play a big role. There is a study also which was carried out recently, and EU did find out that nearly 225 million meters, smart meters for electricity, and 51 million meters for gas will be rolled out by 2024. Of course, these targets are quite less when you compare it with India, where we are targeting a huge 1 billion kind of numbers. But then if you see the next bullet, they says that when by 2024, almost 77% of European consumers will have smart meters for electricity and about 44% for the gas, one for the gas. Of course, on an average, in Europe, it is a quite high cost to roll out these meters, and they say that on an average, the cost of installing a smart meter in EU falls between 180 to 200 euros. This is from a cost side of it. The same study also says, when you see from a savings point of view, on an average, the smart meters provide savings of up to European 230 euros for gas and 270 for smart meters. And of course, this cost saving is spread among consumers, suppliers, distribution companies, but then it is a huge savings when you talk about from a smart meter rollout point of view. From a saving point of view, this is also a big number when you talk about it's 2% to 10% will be saving, pure savings in terms of energy. So this means indirectly it says that this has to happen whether you see it from an emission point of view, from a clean and green energy point of view, smart meter and smart grid, which means smart energy is the reality. We have to do it. And not only this, we have to talk about energy efficiency parameter as well. The last bullet is nothing but it just talks about directives, which is the legislations in Europe. And these are the three numbers which basically have been announced way back in 2009. So since 2009, they have been focusing and targeting about these smart energies and including energy efficiencies. To continue, there are some key policy initiatives. There are various, but then I would touch upon few policy key initiatives. One of the strategy EU has laid down on energy system integrations, because Europe is following a big target of Green Deal, green transition. And as part of this green transition, they are encouraging energy sector integration. And that's why this strategy was announced in July 2020. And as part of this strategy, the ICT and digitization is definitely a key component, but then as a vertical, smart meter and a smart grid are part of it. So this is a strategy as part of the Green Deal. Similarly, digitization, as I said, digitizing the energy system, again they laid down an EU action plan. And again, they have set up a smart grid task force, which basically have been renamed because there was a separate task force for meters, separate task force for grid, but now they realize that they both are interlinked, so they created its smart energy expert group. And one of the hyperlink is among the EU-India partnership. And EU-India has set up a high-level platform on smart grid, so they are cooperating on EU and India basis as well around these topics. Then clean energy. package is also adopted in 2019, and this package does highlight security. So now, as part of this package, apart from energy, they are also emphasizing more on the security side of it. When we do a digitization, we know that we will come across the cybersecurity threats. That's why they're emphasizing through this legislation. With that as a brief synopsis, let me touch upon the standardization side of it. Now, when we start working in EU around standardization, so let's begin with a smart meter, for example. European Commission issues a mandate. A mandate is a request which government asks these standard organizations to develop standards for one particular subject. So there is a mandate number 441, which was issued way back in 2009, asking the European standards organizations to start working on this particular mandate, which means define the communication architecture, which should be open. What should be the architecture of the utility meters involving communication protocol while ensuring the interoperability side of it when you talk about smart metering. So in response to this mandate, the three standards organizations, SENS, ANALAC, and HC, created a coordination group. Because until few years, when these non-ICT sectors were not there, we just put the smart on top of it, which means we brought the ICT layer. Now what happens is, for ICT layer, there is a different standards organization. For non-ICT, there is a different organization. So they decided to resolve this issue. We are a non-ICT standards, bring the ICT, so let's create a coordination group. So ensure that we work on a harmonization. So as part of this work, again, this presentation will be shared. If somebody has an interest to go more into it, these are all hyperlinks. You can click it and you will get more information around it. So the first deliverable was a technical report which talked about the functional reference architecture for communication in smart metering system, and it was published way back in 2011. Then there was a second phase of the deliverable, and again in that they more emphasize on the interoperability side of it. This particular coordination group has also addressed the privacy and security side of it, so various reports were published. And then the latest one is the minimum security requirement for smart metering. This is the last one, which after releasing many other publications. For more information, we have a hyperlink. This was mainly on a smart meter side of it. Let me go to the smart grid. When you talk about grid, again, similar mandate was issued in 2011 after getting the smart metering mandate. And again, as part of this particular grid mandate, they emphasize that when you talk about grid, let's create a reference architecture, which is based on SEGEM. I'm not talking about it because of the time limitations, but then they also talked about sustainable processes covering efficiency, interoperability, security, data protections, more from a grid point of view, and the privacy. They also said that let's find out the set of consistent standard and work in sync with the mandate for the smart meter. So as it is defined, and then they also said when you talk about grid, you have to see the e-mobility, the electric mobility, because it will have an impact on the grid. So there was a mandate saying charging of electric vehicles. So they said, please ensure that you work with this mandate also. When you look at the grid, one is a meter for electricity, gas, and then as well as this charging of the electric mobility or electric vehicles. Again, same coordination group was set up, and these are the few deliverables which we have highlighted, which covering from sustainable processes, and then they consolidated this standard. They says, okay, if we have to do something, let's find out what exists. And globally, these are the same organizations which works with IEC. So they created a report called First Set of Standards, which includes the reference architecture, information security and privacy, and framework documents. So these are deliverables which they released it way back in 2012. Then in 2014, they continued the work and took it to the next level, which means studying the existing standard, let's create an overview methodology, market model development, and smart grid architecture model user manual, and smart grid interoperability side of it, so, and security as well. So this, they consolidated from end to end all these deliverables. These two reports are very important if you want to know more about standards. This Smart Grid Set of Standard Report 1 and 2, it consolidate all these standards which are getting implemented by this smart grid and smart grid systems. As I said, because we talk about ICT side of it, and there is a communication, I think we talked about it through panel discussions as well as some presentations. Smart meter has to communicate with smart grid, and it is a wireless communications. When you talk about wireless communications, there are multiple options available today, whether it is licensed band or unlicensed band, whether it is low power WAN, whether it is G3 PLC, whether it is SIM card to communicate. I mean, the mobile phone has to communicate with a smart meter. So this is the standards organizations which has done a lot of work as part of the communication coordination group. But then one of the technical specification is of importance, which talks about the core platform specification defining interface between UICC, which is a SIM card. It could be eSIM, it could be SIM, and talking with the terminal. So terminal talking to the smart meter. This is the technical specifications, they have delivered it. And they continue with other technical specifications like ontology, smart appliances. So smart meter is also a part of it. So these are some work from an ICT point of view happening at SESEI. Broadly, I mean, a few slides I will talk about the challenges, then how these challenges were addressed in EU. I mean, we talked about standard and interoperability. Whenever you develop a standard, and when you talk about ICT standard, it should interoperate. Because when it will interoperate, then only it will bring the economies of scale. Then only you can take out one smart meter from one location and put it to other locations. Like for your example, your phone. It works any part of the world. This is called interoperability, so it is interoperable. The second part is regulatory challenges. It happens everywhere. I mean, even after implementation, even after producing those reference architecture and set of standards, still the regulatory challenges does exist. New challenges pop up, whether it is through privacy or security. So some initiatives EU took it to address those challenges. Similarly, the data privacy and security side of it. So few of my next slides will talk about that. The biggest is, I think we have been debating for the last 2 days talking about the data. Because when you talk about meter or grid communications, at the end of it, it is data. Now, when you talk about this data, you have to talk about its protection and security at the end of it. So, Commission released a recommendation around this data protection and security, which means they carried out an impact statement. They also ensured that it should be by design. The protection functionality has to be integrated into the system by design and by default settings. And we have to have protection measures to be put in place. And then information and transparency on smart metering. With these objectives, they released a recommendations saying there is a methodology for the economic assessment of the long-term cost and benefit for the rollout of. So this was also the part of recommendation. But then last one is common minimum functional requirement for smart metering for electricity. This was the government recommendations that what should become a common part, common minimum functional requirement. When you roll out a smart meter in Europe, these are the common minimum functional requirement. And this is the part of this recommendation. Then, similar thing happened around data protection impact assessment, as I said in the last slide, but then they created a template. And in this template, they cover the evaluation and decision-making tool, which shall help the entities planning or executing investment in smart grid to identify and anticipate risk towards data protection, privacy, and security. So this is a good template they created as part of this recommendation. This template also provides guidance to help ensure fundamental rights to protection of personal data and to the privacy in the deployment of smart grid application, systems, and metering rollout. And a smart grid task force, as I said earlier, it was established in 2018. They also they had an impact assessment template. They also updated with this latest or new suggestions from the Commission. This was more on the regulation side of it to take care of the regulation challenges, the new one around the data. Then cybersecurity in energy sector, when you talk about it, they also started long back, way back in 2017. They had a regulation on gas security of supply to begin with. Then they released a report called Cyber Security in the Energy Sector, which was a expert cyber security platform. It was released in 2017. Then there was an evaluation of risk of cyber incident and on cost of preventing cyber incident in the energy sector. This was also a study carried out by the European Commission. Then Commission recommendations were released in 2019, which basically provides guidance on how to address the challenges, specific challenges of the energy sector on cyber security and identify the main actions required to preserve cyber security and be prepared for the possible cyber attack in the energy sector. So these are recommendations to take care of cyber security, how best you should be prepared well in advance before it happens. There was another report which covers the sector-specific rules for cyber security, which means the Smart Grid Task Force Group 1. And they talk about, because they have borders, so they were talking about aspects of cross-border electricity flow. What are the common minimum requirement in terms of planning, monitoring, reporting, and crisis management? So this is also another important report which was released by the European Commission. Then there was an implementing decision establishing priority list for the development of network codes and guidance for electricity and the gas. So these are codes, they define, let's define a code which can be applied all across the member states within the European Union. To be continued, when you talk about cyber securities, from the digitization point of view, because we're talking about a critical infrastructure, few following measures were taken from the European Commission. We have a EU cyber security strategy 2020, which basically talks about security of essential services, particularly in the energy sector. So this is a cyber security strategy. Then follow-up of that, there was a Cyber Resilience Act 2022, which is nothing but a regulation on cyber security requirement for product with digital element. And this also bolstered cyber security rules to ensure more secure hardware and software product. There is also a directive on security. They call it Network and Information, NIS directive in EU. And then after that, there is an act called Cyber Security Act. So there was a strategy, and then follow-up of that strategy, there is an act. And if you refer this act, which is a recent one, it strengthened the EU agency for cyber security. So you might hear, if you talk about European aspect of it, there is an agency called ENISA. And it is nothing but an EU agency for cyber security. And they have been assigned responsible for establishing a cyber security certification framework for product and services. Because until now, standards were voluntary, they were getting implemented. We put a lot of legislations, but then what happens? Are we carrying out any testing and certification of it? So this agency has been assigned responsible to create a framework so that cyber security certification could also take place. And this will be implemented EU-wide, a framework. And the last but not the least is recently this month, 18th April 2023, Commission has proposed a targeted amendment to the EU Cyber Security Act to ensure that this certification also becomes a part of the Act. So this is what I can share, and if I conclude my presentation, standard does play an important role when you talk about implementing it as part of any system, especially smart grid and smart meter, because it is a critical infrastructure and interoperability is a key. Digital and sustainable transformation of energy system across European Union is seen as an essential to become independent of fossil fuels, tackle the climate crisis, and ensure affordable access to energy. To achieve this, digitization is must, digitization of energy system. An EU action plan will unlock the potential of digitizing this energy sector and energy savings and benefiting all the consumers. Since Analec ITSE Smart Energy Coordination Group is pioneer, which will take care of the smart grid and smart energy standardization to be continued. But then when you talk about smart energy, we must take care of the energy efficiency side of it as well, which means government is also focusing on eco-design of the product in EU. So when you make product, make sure it is based on the eco-design. Then interoperability to achieve economies of scale, And energy monitoring, saving, and management is also a very important role to play when you talk about energy saving. With that, thank you very much, and you can ask me any questions if you have it. Thank you. As I said in the beginning, when you talk about grid or meter standards, broadly it is based on IEC, which is a global standard body. I do not see, of course I work for European side of it, but EU and India, we are same. And I'm sure, because you see, whenever standard exists or developed at ISO and IEC, it's based on the consensus of around the world. Because if there is an ISO and IEC standard, which means Americans or Europeans, they all agreed to develop some standards. So in my opinion, personally, in case energy sectors, I don't see any difference personally, but of course, we can compare it. But in general, I do not see personally that when you talk about grid and meter standards. But of course, some countries or regions have limited the communication side of it, from between the meter and the grid, for example. Otherwise, if you keep this particular segment open, we are same, personally. But I don't work for Americans, so I don't have the in-depth idea. I'm assuming because global standard exists. Only difference comes when you will see, oh, there is a European standard, which means for sure there is a American standard, which means there is no consensus to develop a global standard. But in smart energy, I do not see any EU-specific standard. All right, thank you very much.
Very much, sir. And for the facilitation, I would like to invite on stage Shri Jaya Vibhav Swami, sir. Kindly please come up on the stage and facilitate our speaker, Mr. Dinesh Chand Sharma. Everyone give it a